this episode, a young father's life is cut tragically short when he enters turbid waters off Australia's west coast. With whales calving nearby and sea lions swimming in and out of the choppy sea, sharks were highly likely to be on the prowl. Professional divers knew the dangers and entered the water at their own risk, unbeknownst to them of the horrifying events that were about to occur beneath the waves. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying shark attack on David Weir. Welcome to Final Affliction. Ever since he was a teenager, David Weir loved to dive in Australia's waters. He held a professional diving license for more than 10 years and was very experienced in the water. He was married with 2 children aged 13 and 3. He had worked as a deckhand on a crayfish boat and more recently had been offered a job as a professional diver. His target catch was abalone. These are large sea snails that attach themselves to rocks and reefs in warm coastal areas. During abalone season, which in Australia runs from November to April, David would regularly fish for them off Australia's west coast. Abalone are considered a delicacy in some parts of the world. They are a healthy food source for many, and whilst they are overfished in some parts of the world, legal fishing of abalone can fetch just over $60 per kilogram or $30 per pound. David and his friends shared the use of the boat. They fitted it to the trailer and drove it down to the beach. They reversed the trailer onto the sand and backed the boat slowly into the water. 29-year-old David and 21-year-old Dave Lashman climbed into the boat. Dave pulled on the cord attached to the outboard engine and fired it up. They motored a kilometer from shore. Their destination was Honeymoon Island, which lies 40 kilometers east of Hopetown. This island is a small granite outcrop frequented by seals and sea lions. They use the island to sun themselves before entering the water to hunt and catch fish. Just off the coast, right whales were reported to be calving. The waters were a hive of activity, and they attracted some of the ocean's greatest predators. Great white sharks hunted the seals and sea lions. When whales were calving, the sharks were attracted by the blood in the water. They feasted on the afterbirth and any weak or lone calves. It was a dangerous time to be in the water. In fact, David was no stranger to sharks. Less than a month before, he and his friends had been chased out of the water by an enormous 5-meter great white shark. And only days before, another diver was chased by a large great white right in the same spot. But that didn't stop David from going back. He knew the dangers. He knew the risks. On the day that David and Dave motored out to the island, the weather was poor. It was September 11th, 1995. There had been recent storms which had churned up the sea. The swell was up, and their little boat rode the waves and smacked back down on the ocean surface. The kelp beds swayed in the strong currents. The sea was murky, and visibility was poor. But David knew where the abalone were. He knew if they could maneuver the boat over the prime spot, he could dive down and collect his haul. Easing the boat closer to the island, Dave held the boat steady whilst David climbed into his dive gear. He was hookah diving, the process by which a diver breathes through a line that is attached to the surface of the water. This way, they don't require any oxygen tanks on their backs. David also carried a pony bottle, a little bottle of oxygen with its own regulator. He clipped this to his harness for use in emergencies. He tugged on his full-length wetsuit and tied his weight belt around his waist. He had a mesh net attached to his belt and a knife in his hand. The water was 8 to 10 meters deep. David needed to dive to the bottom and scour the rocks for the abalone snails that clung to them in large numbers. Dave watched as his friend disappeared under the choppy surface. Seconds later, there was a swirl in the water. Dave watched in terror as he saw the huge tail fin of a shark thrash out of the water. The tail alone must have been about 2 meters across. Dave shouted to David under the water. He was frantic with worry. Then he saw a huge dorsal fin slice through the surface of the water. like a knife through butter. There was more commotion in the water, a boiling and fizzing. Seconds later, the white bubbles turned red. Dave couldn't see what was happening under the water. David must have dived into the water just as the shark swam by. The attack occurred within a matter of seconds of David submerging below the surface. Frantically, Dave motored the boat right through the blood-stained water. As he did so, he grabbed hold of the hookah rig. He tugged the air supply hose. It was slack. There was no resistance. He kept pulling, hauling the line on board. Then he got to the end of it. Still attached was a shredded harness, and still attached to the harness was the little pony bottle and tooth marks. David was nowhere to be seen. Dave leaned over the side of the boat. He scoured the water, shouting desperately, but there was no sign of him or the shark. Then he saw something rising from the depths. He could just make out a shadow. Something moved towards the surface. To Dave's shock, David's body bobbed up the surface. He had been severely mauled and, tragically, he was clearly dead. Dave tried to grab his friend's body. He leaned right over the water, trying desperately to grab a hold of David's torso, but his hands kept slipping. Moments later, David's body sank. In utter shock and devastation, Dave sped back to the shore. The engine revved and roared as he tore over the waves. He ran the boat up onto the beach at Starvation Bay and quickly jumped onto the sand. He shouted to some fishermen nearby who came running over. When he told them what had happened, they all ran to their vehicle. They gave Dave a lift to Hopetown to report the incident to officials. The events of that terrible day, of course, still haunt those who knew and loved David. His friends have always spoken highly of him, of the exciting fishing career he was heading for, and of his young family he left behind. Regardless of the shark attacks that happen in Australia's waters, you never expect it to happen to you or a loved one. Following a tragic incident such as this, there are always debates about sharks and control measures needed to keep people safe in the water. Shark drumlines and nets are deployed along some of Australia's most popular beaches. Bill Foster, who at the time worked for the Australian Marine Conservation Society, said that the shark probably mistook David for a sea lion or whale calf. People have argued comments like these before. They argue that sharks are highly intellectual and can tell the difference between humans and their usual prey. But sharks are also opportunistic hunters, and when it's whale calving season and they are calving within miles of a dive spot, the water is highly likely to attract more sharks. Having said that, David wasn't entirely eaten by the shark. He was savagely killed, and his body washed ashore 3 days later. It is likely, in this case, the shark realized the mistaken identity, but it was too late for David. There were definitely warning signs for the young father of two. Media reports stated that he had been pursued by a shark only 3 weeks before his fatal attack, and another diver only a few days before the incident. If these were true, then they served as a stern warning to David. There have been cases when shark attacks have been more common during high water turbidity, as the water is murky, and both shark and human are less able to spot each other. On the day of the shark attack, the water was thick with kelp and underwater visibility was poor. All of these things suggest that it was a very dangerous dive that David was embarking on, and the fatality could have been avoided if the conditions or season had been different. Instead, David Weir, knowing the risks, went diving that day anyway, leading to his terrifying final affliction.